All right, we're going to turn to Andrew Marvell at this point in the course. Marvell is, in my estimation, after Milton, whom we're not dealing with in the 17th century course because we have our own separate course devoted to Milton. But after Milton and Donne and Herbert, the greatest poet of the period, certainly in the amongst those that are considered to be metaphysical poets. So those who fall under the influence of John Donne and to a lesser degree George Herbert, Marvell is in that vein. Born in 1621 and dies in 1678. So he lives to the age of 66, if you're doing your math. He is in many ways a very compelling embodiment of the change that undergoes in England during his period, because he is in many ways a very transitional figure. So he does write in ways that we could recognize as metaphysical. He uses their wit. He has much of the complexity of the metaphysical poets, like Donne and to a lesser extent Herbert. But at the same time, he does have features of the Cavalier poets and their dedication to classicism and something of their grace, I would say, as well. He's interesting also politically. Remember, this period is that in which the English Civil War is waged. First, Charles I is eventually executed, and he is replaced by a Republican government under Oliver Cromwell. And Marvell begins his poetic career in many ways as a celebrator of the Republic. He writes panegyrics in praise of the Lord Protector Cromwell, but eventually becomes rather disenchanted with that and writes more in a satirical vein and attacks both the court and the established church. He is very much under the influence of Lord Fairfax, who's a very important figure that I have not probably devoted enough time to here. Fairfax was the leader of the Republican armies against Charles I. Now, Lord Fairfax was an aristocrat himself and was brought into opposition to Charles I simply because Charles I was acting like a tyrant. He had suspended Parliament. He was acknowledging none of the privileges that had been bestowed or had been recognized amongst the aristocracy since Magna Carta. And so Fairfax rode out against him. Where they parted ways, that is, Fairfax and the Republicans, was when it came to the killing of the monarch. Fairfax saw this as a bad precedent and wanted no part of it and withdrew from that, and against his wishes, the king was executed. So Fairfax was a significant figure for the Republican cause, but he had some notes of dissent with this. But he was an important figure for Andrew Marvell. And he writes, one of the poems we're going to look at upon Appleton House is that of the aristocrat Fairfax's house, and it fits in with the country house poem that we've already discussed. I haven't lectured yet, but those are coming, that we've seen in relation to a variety of figures ranging from Johnson to Amelia Lanier. And there are others besides that. He also writes Horatian odes, which are political forms of addresses, and so forth. My favorite poem of his is To His Coy Mistress, but we'll come to that when we come to it. Marvell is very much associated with metaphysical poetry in a different sense. He pushes his lyrical, or at least his most important or at least significant innovative lyrics in the direction of pastoral poetry. in the garden and in some of his other poems, the mower against gardens, Damon the mower to the glowworms, etc., we see a devotion to the idea of a garden, and it is not just an idea, but an ideal. The famous lines of the garden annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade have probably got the influences of Neoplatonism. And I mentioned that in Isabel Rivers' book, there's a good discussion of many themes of the classical or the Renaissance era, and her little chapter on Neoplatonism is particularly good here and does include reference to Andrew Marvell's work here. And it is a theme here, and one of the themes which this is just an introduction, but one of the themes that rises is the sense of nature as this ideal or idealizing place, which is common to English speakers in our day because of the Romantic poets. And in some ways, Marvell sounds a little bit like William Wordsworth in his idealization of nature. One of the questions that comes up from this, however, is whether Marvell means the same thing by nature that Wordsworth does. And I think the answer is clearly and unequivocally no, he does not mean the same thing by it. But it would be challenging to demonstrate that just simply with reference to the poetry itself. It's more the product of the age and the time. But when Marvell writes about an idealization of nature, we need to step back a bit and use this, question this word nature. I mentioned this in our class together. Nature is a word that requires considerable care and scrutiny. The whole idea of nature, as the historian Collingwood remarked in the 19th century, undergoes a significant change. C.S. Lewis is helpful. I think I've got the book here. Yes, I do. In his book Studies in Words, he looks at this word nature and spends 50 pages in showing us the roots of this word nature and how the concept changes over time. So the Study in Words, the second chapter running from pages 24 to 74, looks at nature in conjunction with words like physis and kind and physical and so forth. And one of the things we need to note is that the Bible does not use the word nature. It uses the word creation and a created order, a word which obviously has the implications of a creator, whereas the word nature first appears in Stoic philosophy and Stoic thought, and does not contain the implications or even the ideas of a creator, a divine mind or a divine person, a divine being who's brought the world into being. And the Stoics would have lived in an era of polytheism. So they certainly don't settle on the idea that there is an originator or a creator of the world, but nonetheless that the world exists and it has a certain order to it that ought to be preserved. That's a Stoic idea. It's one that gains increasing credibility when we come to the Enlightenment, which, remember, follows this 17th century period. I don't think that Marvell is speaking as an Enlightenment thinker and appealing to a Stoic notion of nature. He is using the idea of creation and a created order as a man more influenced by Christian thinking. He's a friend and colleague of Milton, by the way, I should say, before I go on, and was very important in interceding on Milton's behalf when Cromwell's government fell, and those who were responsible in the government for executing Charles I were therefore under duress and probably the threat of their own lives by his son, Charles II. And Marvell interceded on Milton's behalf, said that he was of no harm to anybody, to some degree had not been responsible for the actions of those whose apologist he became, and for which reason we now have Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes, because Milton wrote those while under house arrest, which was the best that Marvell could do for him at that point. So very influential even in that limited sense. But he is a significant figure who writes, and again, for my money, on this topic of nature. So nature for Marvell, what does it mean? Well, it is clearly an idealized type of world. It is a realm which, to my mind, has probably some sort of an analogy to the world that is depicted in the Country House poems. So, as I say, that work of his own on Appleton House, a Garden of Eden of sorts. And so it brings up the theme, which is again common in the 16th and 17th century, of the desire in the Renaissance to go back to the roots or the sources of things. And this extends so far as to seek to recover the primal state of innocence. And remember, in Milton's work of education, he says that the aims of education are to restore the lost ruins of our first parents by learning to know God aright. And so the aim of education is one of recovery and restoration. It's not of progress. It's not of advancing new knowledge. That's of that sentiment we find in Francis Bacon. And Bacon's agenda of scientific progress contains the idea of gaining power over nature, of using nature, as if nature is a thing to be, a malleable thing to be, and a material thing for us to be exploited. I'll say more on that, but this is a decisive period in which we get, on the one hand, a strong articulation of the aims of education being to recover what is lost. And I think that is the spirit behind Milton, or rather Marvell's appeal to the greenness and to the country house as an Edenic state. So going back to a paradisal state on earth, which is brought about through the cultivation of the Christian aristocrat. On the one hand, there's that tension. And on the other hand, there's this move towards the Baconian novum organum of science and the idea of scientific progress, which takes shape in the form of the Royal Society in 1688, and its motto, nullius in verbo, trust no one's word. In other words, experiment and verify for yourself. Do it. Don't appeal to the teaching of anyone in the past. Don't seek to recover the knowledge or hold on to the knowledge of the past. Gain new knowledge. So there's a gulf here in this period, and as I say, Marvell marks one of the transition figures in this, but I do not think that he represents the Enlightenment. He's one of the last figures that will be holding on to the goods of the 17th century. So I think that's a good little introduction to it. I'll move on to the specifics of the poems in the next lecture, but this is it for now. Thank you.